this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Jackie Stavros and Cheri Torres, the authors of Conversations Worth Having, using appreciative inquiry to fuel productive and meaningful engagement. As we resume the conversation, Cheri is discussing the 5 principles that govern our conversations. All right, you say that tone and direction are simple cues that tell us what kind of conversation we're in, but knowing how you got into that conversation is really important to understand. And you go on to describe 5 principles that govern our conversations. What are those?
So the 5 principles, this is what David Cooperrider discovered in his research, that there was a wealth of research across multiple disciplines that all reinforced these same 5 principles. The first one is the constructionist principle, and that simply says that we create our social systems in our conversations by the way we make meaning together and by the questions and the interactions that we have. And so whatever systems are here, whatever system is in your organization, it was created by a conversation, and another conversation with a different focus can change that. The second principle is the simultaneity principle, and that's the notion that change happens the moment you ask the question or the moment you make the statement, that our systems, our biological, neurophysiological systems are wired to respond to sensory input. And words are powerful sensory input. So before I might even get a full question out, your body's already responding. So if I ask, what problems are you having? You're going to go in one direction, whereas if I say, tell me about one of your best experiences with that situation, you go in a completely different direction. And it's simultaneous. The third principle is the principle of anticipation, or the anticipatory principle. And that's the notion that we move in the direction of our expectations and what we anticipate, and also the way we are wired. Just neurologically, we see, hear, and experience what we are looking for, and we miss the rest. So there's a wealth of information out there, and whatever we're anticipating or expecting, that's what we look for, and then we say, see, I'm right, I've got it. So it's that notion that when you know that what you're anticipating is going to influence what you actually see or get, it's an invitation to expand or open or drop your expectations so that you can see and hear more. The fourth one is the poetic principle. And that's the notion that there's no one truth about any given system or person. It depends on what you look for. And this is actually a reflection of how David Cooperrider stepped into this amazing approach. In his research, he surveyed people at the Cleveland Clinic, which has one of the best reputations for a national medical health care clinic in the country. And he and his fellow graduate students were looking for problems to solve for their dissertation topics. And when he came back and he brought the data and showed them to his major professor and Ron Fry, they said, there's just something wrong here. Look at this organization. It is riddled with problems. This can't possibly be the Cleveland Clinic. And David was like, well, but that's what the answers were. And so he went back with a different set of questions to a group of people, a group of questions that was asking, why are you the best in the country? And what are your leadership strengths or your research strengths that allow you to, they were all appreciative inquiry questions, later to be called that. And when he came back, they were 2 totally different organizations. And that's the poetic principle, that the questions you ask and what you look for determine how you assess or see the person or the situation. And so being cognizant of that is super important. And then the final principle is the positive principle, sometimes called the generative principle, which is the more positive our questions, it's actually the more generative our questions, and the greater the possibility for them to generate new ways of thinking, new imagery, And those compel us to move in different directions.
I think a couple things came to mind when you were talking. One is you're talking about the simultaneous and the kind of the body language aspect of that and how it's instantaneous. I was wondering, in this world of Zoom and video conferencing, does that have an impact on that? Because I know when we're face to face and I can see the entire body, right? I mean, right now I can see your faces, but in general, if I'm in a room with you, I can see your body language more than just your facial expressions. Does that have any impact on this at all?
I would say it probably has some. And so much of what we respond to is facial and tone and tenor. And so I think that we are still remarkably being able to create close connections. And we're also, our nervous system is wired to detect the most subtle thing, that if I look at you, I would say your face didn't change. But internally, my nervous system went, ooh, I saw that little tiny muscle in his cheek go down. I need to be careful here. And That's all subconscious. So it's all going on at this level that we can't. If we were to try to control it, we wouldn't be able to stay in the conversation. We would be so internal.
That's why so much of the stuff has to be on autopilot in your brain, right? So
yes.
I'd like to add, so I work at a university, and we kind of started the fall semester with mask on in the classroom with our undergrads, and something was not working right. And so I took the class on Wednesdays onto Zoom, these young undergrads, because their masks were off. And even though I could only see, 1-inch squares, it totally changed the dynamics of the class. As Cheri said, I could see their facial expressions. And then our non-traditional adults, MBA students, they went 100% online. And I asked them last night to come to class because we were doing presentations. I said, I want good lighting. I want you to look good from the waist up. Totally different class in the first 6 weeks. They couldn't wear hats. They weren't sitting in the dark. They're screaming. It was such a fun night that, because we have to work remotely, you have to experiment with tone and direction, lighting, even what they're wearing. They were just fabulous last night on Zoom.
I've had situations like that where I mentioned one person that said, "Can you turn a light on? You look like you're in the witness protection program. I can't see you at all." I know there's somebody in that black blob because I see something moving, but I can't really tell who it is. Another one of the principles you just mentioned also, a thought came to mind, was about how we hear things to our certain, the way we want to hear them, right? And I'm reminded of, when I think about communication and conversation, one of the things that I think about is the game we probably all played as children called telephone, where say there's 4 or 5 of you in a row, and of course the first person whispers a secret to the second person, and it passes on down the line. And of course the fun of the game is that what person number 5 says is not remotely close to what person number 1 actually said. Right. And so what happens is each person, you could argue they are communicating because each person whispers a secret to the next person, but that person now hears that secret through their own bias, their own life experiences, the way they define words, the things that they latch onto, as you were saying, and they interpret the message and pass it on to the next person who then reinterprets it. And so it's really no surprise that the message gets mangled as it moves through the 5 bodies. And that's a game we play as kids, but now you think about the same thing inside of an organization. It's not surprising that your message gets mangled. And of course, the way to fix that would be what we're talking about today, which is having conversations, because then each person, when they hear the message, they can turn back and say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that word? And when you say turn left, do you mean like right now or at the stop sign? And by asking those clarifying questions, you're able to get a much better interpretation of what the message really intends that you can then pass on. And so now the message should stay fairly straightforward as it moves through the organization or in that game comes out.
Yes.
Should. All right. You also mentioned the positive principle or generative principle is the idea that the more positive our questions and comments, the more positive our actions and potential. And there's research that confirms this. I'm an engineer, so I always love anything that smacks of math, and y'all come through for me with 3 ratios from the research. Before we discuss the ratios, though, let's talk about the 3 areas of research. What are they?
Sure, I'd love to talk about that. So earlier we said the introduction was a gift from David. Chapter 6 in our book It's Not Magic, It's Science was like a last minute best surprise we put in the book.
Love the title, by the way.
Thank you. It feels like magic, but it's not. And again, we were working with our editor and we thought, what about the people who need, you just said the engineers, they need the science, the skeptics in the world. This chapter is such a chapter of what this is all about. In the three areas of research we pulled from was the new science, positive image, and positive psychology. I will tell you, we probably rewrote this chapter 30 times to get this research easily for you to understand. Of course, the new science really isn't that new, but we kicked off with the new science, and it's all about the pre-framing. The way you frame things in the brain can change your brain chemistry. And so as Cheri talked about positive imagery and positive experiences, they bring your brain into a state of coherence. And that allows for the oxygen to get to the right parts of the brain, the nervous system, and allows for reasoning and critical thinking to take place so that you're having conversations that connect us and impact performance. The third one, positive image, positive action, a lot of that came out of David Cooperrider's dissertation research that Cheri mentioned, and we move towards the images we hold in our brains and anticipate, and about positive affect and effect. And it reminds me, I used to be a lifeguard, and when I would say to the kids, and I didn't know this, but when I was 16 years old, I'd say, don't run on the deck. All they heard was run on the deck, and they slipped and fall. Or don't dive in the shallow end. All they heard was dive. And there are actually training lifeguards to use what do you really want the kids to do around the pool area? And those are the commands you need. And that's that simultaneity principle, is giving them the commands that they can imagine. And then they start walking and they don't even know why they're walking, because you said walk on the deck, not don't run. So I didn't have that in those days. And then, of course, is positive psychology, which is a big movement. And Barbara Fredrickson and Cheri can talk about the ratios, but positivity, what good are positive emotions? That they create upward spirals of confidence and optimism and joy. And Marty Seligman is considered the grandfather of positive psychology, and he's done a lot of research in PERMA, and we talk about that, which is positive emotions, engagement. R stands for relationships. It has to be meaningful, the M in achievement. So those are the three sciences that we focus on in the book.
I guess I need to give my brother a shout out here then, because as adults, at least, I would start this conversation or statement by going, don't, and he'd say, stop. Just don't even put that in. What's the positive thing you want me to hear? I'm like, oh, okay. So he's into this, didn't even know it, right?
Yeah.
And as an engineer, I'm starting to feel a little beat up here. You're talking about engineers. I interviewed Cheri Torres from MIT last week. And of course, her whole thing is around dealing with MIT engineers, and she's in conversation, and she's actually in the other AI, talking about that kind of AI. And so I'm starting to feel a little beat up.
No, I work mostly with engineers. I'm at Lawrence Tech University. It's an engineering school. So there's hope.
So you have to put up with us, right?
Well, and there are important times to be looking for what's not working and to create fixes. It's typically, though, not when you're dealing with people.
Mechanical or mechanistic, mechanical.
Or functional, versus human beings don't need to be fixed. They need to be
loved and nurtured.
And have a conversation with them.
Well, I'll talk about engineers because I am one, and certainly that's an aspect that I've noticed throughout my career. I went to Georgia Tech, which of course is full of engineers. Yeah. And then from there, my whole life has been spent around doing project management with mostly engineers. And certainly what I've observed is what you all are talking about as well, which is the analytical skills that make one good at being an engineer and being able to problem solve doesn't always leave room, I think, for the relationship skills. And so those are the folks, and I'm stereotyping a bit here, but since I am one, I can do it.
Yes.
They're the ones that don't want to come to the meetings. They see the meetings as a waste of time. I don't need to talk to you. I'll just shoot you an email. That's the least amount of confrontation I have to have with somebody. So I speak a lot of times about the positive or the power of relationships and the power of people. And in my world, project work, obviously it's all people related. And so we want you to do the problem solving skills at your desk when you're solving the problem. But the project as a whole is something that was a collaborative that we're all in together. And I think that is a skill that we need to shore up for those of us that are engineers that have this great math-based mind. But what about the people side of the equation?
Yeah, and there's some wonderful work that's been done blending appreciative inquiry with project management as well as with Lean Six Sigma practices, and they're far more effective when the blend is there. That whole socio-technical piece.
Okay, let's talk about those ratios. I'm waiting to talk about these. So first, there was some work done by Marshall Lasada and Emily Heffy. What were the results?
So they looked at the conversations, the dialogue amongst teams. And they were looking to find out whether or not there was a difference between high-performing teams and low-performing teams. And they used measurements like outcomes, profitability, and 360-degree reviews to actually measure performance. And what they found was that a 6-to-1 ratio of basically conversations worth having, conversations that generated positivity and high engagement that added value, that a 6-to-1 ratio was the score for high-performing teams. The other interesting thing that they found was that there was a 1-to-1 correlation between affirmative conversations and conversations worth having. So that notion of being able to advocate for your position, but then asking questions about other people's positions and what they were advocating for. And that's pretty remarkable outcomes, and they're outcomes that every organization wants, right? High performance and profitability.
So John Gottman did some research on what makes a marriage succeed. Tell us about the magic ratio.
Yeah, this is pretty impressive research. His whole life was dedicated to couples, and his research was on what makes for couples with lasting relationships. And he did a 20-year longitudinal study where in the late 1980s, early 1990, he had a group of couples that had recently gotten married, and he videotaped them interacting with each other for 15 minutes. And based upon that, he predicted which ones would be married and which ones would be divorced 20 years later. And they tracked these people and went back, and he predicted with a 93% accuracy rate based upon 15 minutes of observing people. And what he was looking for, what he tracked, were comments that either supported the other person, showed care, curiosity about the other person's point of view and basically conversations that were appreciative versus conversations that were depreciative. And that's pretty telling in terms of what it takes to be in a good marriage, 5-to-1.
Did they say when he did the research? Is it in the honeymoon phase or after the honeymoon phase? Because I feel like the conversations change over time, right?
They do change over time. And it was early on with couples who just recently married.
Wow. That's 93%. That's pretty staggering. So I got to write that one down for sure, 5-to-1. You also discussed the work done by, you mentioned Barbara Fredrickson. What ratio did she come up with?
She came up with a 3-to-1 ratio. And her work is all around what kind of a ratio actually gives you the access to your full thinking capacity. So what she found was a 3-to-1 ratio actually broadens and builds your capacity for higher order thinking, creativity, connection to people, emotional intelligence. And it's not just about being happy. She tracked positive emotions like contentment and curiosity, interest, care, those kinds of things, that all the positive emotions fit into that, and that maintaining a 3-to-1 positivity ratio is enough to give you the full access of your neural thinking capacity. And she also looked at the upper edge, and she said, if you get above an 11-to-1 ratio, it becomes fluff, and it's not healthy. And in fact, she says it's probably not always a good thing to always be positive, because there are some things out there that are not.
The world is not all rainbows and unicorns.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, growing up in the South, we're kind of taught you should always be nice. And so through my journey, I've learned that's not always the best thing. And so if you spend any time in the South, by the way, if you hear somebody use the term bless your heart, you've just been insulted. You just don't know it yet.
Yes.
You need to backtrack in the conversation to figure out why
did they
they're
say
saying
that?
bless your heart.
What did I miss?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that guy drinks too much. Bless his heart. There's always the insult is always preceding it. You just got to follow it. All right. So in summary, the positive and negative ratios are 3-to-1 to maintain positivity, 5-to-1 for successful relationships, and 6-to-1 for high performing teams. I'm sensing a theme here. Be positive, but not exclusively, right?
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we actually came up with a blend of those that fits right in line with the 80-20 rule. 80% of your time, if 80% of your time is spent being positive or engaging in conversations worth having, then even if you have the 20% critical conversations, it doesn't destroy the relationships or the teamwork at all.
Well, I think your stories do a really good job of that in the book, because when I would first read the story and I would think, well, how in the world are you going to turn this into are we just going to have a positivity party where we don't talk about anything negative? But that's not the case. In every story, the negative thing that we needed to fix was definitely there. It definitely came out. It was just done in a way that didn't feel like you were getting beat up as much as, hey, there's a lot of the good things here, and this would even be better if we got this thing fixed. So I thought it was, again, really, really well done. Before I finish up, any closing thoughts?
I guess I just would want to point out that we're on this mission to change our worlds of conversations. You mentioned politics. Just think how simple it is. We're talking 2 practices: how you ask questions, generative questions, and positive framing. And our publisher, Barrett Kohler, their mission statement is to connect people and ideas to create a world that works for all. And Cheri and I are trying to just show others, how do you create conversations that create a world that works for people in that environment.
That's awesome. So Cheri, I understand you guys are working on the 2nd edition, and you mentioned something called Tuning In. What is that about?
It's about making sure that when you are in conversation or about to start a conversation, that you are at a place of being able to choose with awareness how you're going to engage in that conversation. So we offer a technique of pause. This is if you're about to say something and you realize you're in either a place of negativity or your emotions are really triggered, to pause and then take a deep breath, or 2 or 3. That deep breath actually calms the nervous system. And while you're breathing, to get curious. What's going on for me? I wonder if that's what that other person actually meant, or was I just making something up? What do I want this conversation to do? And that little 3-step process can happen in a fraction of a minute, but it's enough to lower the emotional hijack so that you can choose how to engage in that conversation. The two steps, the generative questions and positive framing, are really simple. The hard part is practicing and learning to retrain our habit of reacting into a habit of choosing with awareness.
When does the 2nd edition you think will be released?
November, I think November 2nd.
Yeah,
Oh,
November
excellent.
2021. Mm-hmm.
So it's already with the editor, or y'all are still polishing it up?
End of the month.
Yeah.
Polishing away.
As a project manager, I have to ask the question: which month?
March, yes. Good question. Yeah, we're
no
close.
sneaking that by me.
We're close. We're really close.
That's good. That's awesome. I'm glad. I'll look forward to that one as well then. It's been really enlightening having y'all on the show today. We've covered so much and really only scratched the surface. If someone wants to learn more about you and the work you do, how can they do that?
Sure. You can go to our website, which is www.conversationsworthhaving.today. So it's conversations with an S, worthhaving.today. And you can download the introduction by David Cooperrider, our preface. We have a free toolkit. You can meet our certified trainers in a variety of areas. We have our Monday Kickstarters, a blog there. So there's a lot of information to get started on having a conversation worth having.
That's awesome.
Oh, wait, I had a question for you.
Okay.
Since this was all about conversations worth having, could you tell us what made you land on a Conversations podcast?
So thank you for that question, by the way. But I think for me, it was really through my journey of project management and the work I've done. I've written 2 books as well. And one of the things I noticed, as we mentioned earlier, as an engineer, the people skills sometimes are lacking. And I thought, what can I do to help help folks like that maybe need a little bit of help on the conversation side. First of all, recognize there's a difference. Like when I wrote my last book, there's a chapter called Communicate Like a Person, Not an Emoji. And it turned out that I've been wrong my whole life about the definition of communication. I thought communication was what you and I are doing today, but what we're doing is having a conversation, which is an oral exchange of information, whereas communication can be one-sided. And what I notice is people, and again, I tend to think people can be negative at times, but people tend to shoot one-way text messages, emails. They tend to land on the text-based one-way journeys. And I think it's because it's just convenient. It's easy. Whereas if I actually pick up the phone, walk down the hallway and ask you the question, I might find out that I'm not done with this thing I thought I was done with. And now I've got 3 more things on my list. And I wanted to remind people we need to have conversations. And so the journey for this podcast has really been to have 3 types of people on the show. One is authors that have written books, I think, that will help the listeners understand how to get better in this conversational skill, because I think it is something you can develop. Right. The second one is to have academics that have done research on the show as well, to talk about research that's going on in the space around conversation. And then third is to have business people that have seen the power of conversations. So that's really the purpose, is to give the listeners something that they can take home and really get better at this, because it is something that's such an important skill, and it's something that we need to get better at.
Well, you're excellent at this, Clint. And thanks for having Cheri and I.
It's been really fun.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.